All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at the rise and fall of R. Kelly, a story many of you have been asking for.
Definitely a story with a lot to unpack.
Yeah, we've been going through a bunch of different sources, like biographical stuff about his life, of course, his music, and then all the court documents from his legal troubles, which are pretty extensive.
Absolutely.
So our goal, I guess, today is to trace that path from, a Chicago kid to the self-proclaimed king of R&B and then ultimately a convicted criminal.
Right.
And I think looming over all of this is that huge question, can we, or even should we, try to separate the art from the artist in this case?
It's a question a lot of people grapple with, especially with someone like R. Kelly, whose music and personal life seems so intertwined. It's almost impossible to talk about one without the other.
Yeah. And even his early years, you see this real contrast. So born in Chicago in 1967, pretty rough upbringing, poverty, single mother. And he was a victim of sexual abuse himself as a child. He later revealed that.
That early trauma is such a crucial piece of this puzzle. It's difficult not to consider how those experiences might have shaped his understanding of relationships and power. It's a complex issue for sure.
It is. It's heavy stuff. And then, making things even more complicated, amidst all of that, he finds this escape in music. Singing in church becomes his haven, and his talent is obvious from a very young age.
Oh, yeah, his high school music teacher at Kenwood Academy, she really saw something special in him, apparently encouraged him strongly to pursue music professionally.
And then the big break comes, literally, in 1989. He forms this group called MGM, which stood for Musically Gifted Men.
Okay.
And they win a talent show called Big Break, and it was judged by Natalie Cole.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, pretty huge.
That must have been such a defining moment for him. Think about it, a young guy from that kind of background suddenly on national television, winning a competition judged by a legend like Natalie Cole. It had to have been a huge confidence booster and maybe solidified his belief that music was his way out.
It's a pretty incredible story. From those tough streets of Chicago to performing on stage with Natalie Cole.
It is, and that rise didn't stop there. By '91, he signed with Jive Records, releases his debut album Born into the '90s with his group Public Announcement. It did well, but it was '93 that really launched him into superstardom.
Oh, yeah, 1993, the year of 12 Play, and the song that, for better or worse, became his signature hit, Bump and Grind.
Yeah.
I mean, 12 weeks at #1 on the Billboard R&B charts. That's a record. That song was everywhere.
Yeah.
What was it about the music scene at the time that really allowed a song like Bump and Grind to become such a phenomenon?
Well, the early '90s in R&B, it was kind of this melting pot, right? You had new jack swing, hip hop was becoming more and more influential. There was this energy and fusion of styles, and Kelly, he really tapped into all of that. His music, I mean, it was catchy, sensual, and it definitely had an edge that set him apart. Obviously resonated with a huge audience.
And that edge is what earned him the title, right? King of R&B.
Mhm.
He just dominated the charts for years, hit after hit. I Believe I Can Fly, Ignition, Remix, Step in the Name of Love, and the list goes on.
Oh, and we can't forget Trapped in the Closet, that epic, ongoing musical saga. I mean, he was collaborating with the biggest names in the industry. Michael Jackson, Celine Dion, even Jay-Z. He was a singer, songwriter, producer, a true force in music.
And yet, even as his career is blowing up, there are always these whispers, these allegations lurking in the background, almost from the beginning.
And that's what makes his story so disturbing. Even at his peak, the public perception of him was complicated, to say the least. There were rumors, tabloid stories, accusations of inappropriate behavior, especially with younger women.
Makes you wonder how those early warnings were dealt with. Did the media, really investigate, or was there a tendency to just sort of brush things aside because of his success?
Yeah, it's a good question. How we as a society, particularly the media, handle these kinds of accusations against powerful figures, it really says a lot about our values. I think it's safe to say those early accusations didn't get the same level of scrutiny they would today.
And then, 1994, that's when the first major scandal hits his secret marriage to Aaliyah, who was just 15 years old at the time. This wasn't just a rumor. This was huge.
Absolutely. The marriage certificate even listed Aaliyah's age as 18, which was obviously falsified. The marriage was annulled eventually, but the damage was done. This event really forced everyone to face those power dynamics, the potential manipulation involved.
This had to be a turning point, not just for his public image, but for a lot of people's personal connection to his music. Did this event change your view of his music back then?
It's a question we all need to ask ourselves. Were we as a society ignoring the red flags because we liked the music? This situation with Aaliyah raised very serious concerns about the potential exploitation of a young, vulnerable artist.
Sadly, this was just the beginning of his legal troubles. 2002, a video surfaces allegedly showing him engaged in sexual acts with an underage girl. He's indicted on 21 counts of child pornography. What followed was a 6-year legal battle.
This was a huge turning point, I think, in the public's perception of him. Those charges were incredibly serious, the details were very disturbing, yet, despite all the evidence presented, Kelly was acquitted in 2008.
How is that even possible, acquitted with such serious charges?
The acquittal, it really came down to the alleged victim and her family choosing not to testify, which, just shows how complicated these cases can be, especially when you're talking about someone with the power and influence of R. Kelly. The pressure on victims in these situations can be immense.
It's a scary reminder that even with what seems like overwhelming evidence, justice isn't always guaranteed. But this wasn't the end of R. Kelly's story or his reckoning. Yeah, it's like these two parallel stories were going on,
Oh.
R. Kelly, the musical genius, and then R. Kelly, the accused predator. And for so long, they just kind of coexisted. But then something really shifted in the culture and everything changed.
Right. You're talking about the hashtag MeToo movement, which really gained traction around 2017. It gave survivors of sexual abuse a platform, a voice, to finally break the silence and hold their abusers accountable.
And for R. Kelly, hashtag #MeToo was like this catalyst for a reckoning that was a long time coming. In 2019, that Lifetime documentary Surviving R. Kelly aired, and the impact was pretty immediate.
Yeah, I think what made that documentary so powerful was the sheer number of women who came forward. They were sharing these really harrowing stories of abuse and manipulation, describing a system that was almost cult-like.
It was no longer just allegations, it was the survivors themselves, telling their stories, demanding to be heard.
Exactly, and it really resonated with viewers. What happened after that documentary aired? Was there a public outcry?
Oh, absolutely. There was outrage, protests, renewed calls for accountability, law enforcement started paying attention, new investigations were launched, and more women came forward, emboldened by the stories they'd seen in the documentary.
It really shows the power of these personal testimonies, doesn't it? And the role of media, how it can amplify those voices.
Definitely. And the cultural shift that hashtag #MeToo started, well, it created an environment where real change was possible. And for R. Kelly, that change came pretty fast. After the documentary aired, he faced such intense scrutiny, and the backlash was huge. I mean, his record label, RCA Records, dropped him.
Wow. So that severed his ties with Sony Music completely.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty significant hit, right? Both professionally and financially.
Absolutely. That's a huge deal. It was a clear message that the music industry wasn't going to protect him anymore.
And it wasn't just the industry. Brands, sponsors, they all started distancing themselves. Concert venues canceled his shows. He was basically becoming untouchable.
And then came the legal repercussions. Didn't he get arrested shortly after the documentary?
Yeah, in February 2019, just a month after Surviving R. Kelly aired, he was arrested in Chicago on a whole bunch of new charges.
So this wasn't just rehashing old allegations. This is new stuff.
Right, these were federal charges. He was indicted on racketeering, sex trafficking, and sexual exploitation of minors. The allegations were basically describing this pattern of using his fame and his wealth to recruit and control underage girls. And it was going on for decades.
So we're talking about a systemic pattern of abuse, not just isolated incidents.
Right, exactly. The indictment was outlining this whole system of exploitation, and it spanned multiple states. The level of manipulation and coercion, it's really disturbing.
It took a while, didn't it, for the case to go to trial?
Yeah, a couple of years. But in September 2021, the verdict came in guilty on all 9 counts, including racketeering and sex trafficking. And in June 2022, he was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison.
Wow, 30 years.
That conviction was a big deal. I mean, it showed that even powerful celebrities aren't above the law, and that this kind of systematic abuse would have serious consequences.
But even after that, there were more legal battles ahead, right?
Yeah, he still had separate charges in Chicago to deal with.
Oh, right, I remember that.
So in a separate federal trial in Chicago, he was found guilty of producing child pornography and enticing minors for sex. And in February 2023, he got another 20 years tacked onto his sentence. Most of it will be served concurrently with a 30-year sentence, though.
So realistically, he's looking at spending the rest of his life in prison.
Most likely, yeah. These sentences combined, they reflect the gravity of his crimes, the impact his actions had on his victims. It's really a tragic downfall for someone who was once considered a musical genius. R. Kelly's story, it just highlights the complexities of fame, talent, and how darkness can hide even beneath a charismatic persona.
It really makes you question our roles as consumers of music and fans of artists, doesn't it? Can we or should we even attempt to separate the art from the artist when the artist has done such terrible things?
It's a question we each have to grapple with, I guess. But I think there's a larger point here that goes beyond R. Kelly himself.
What's that? What are you thinking?
Well, his case, it exposes the systems that allow this kind of abuse to flourish. It makes us look at those power dynamics, the whole cult of celebrity, and how institutions sometimes protect abusers while silencing the victims. We started this deep dive asking if we can separate the art from the artist. And while that's a tough question to answer, I think the things we've learned, they go beyond that initial question. This is about understanding the systems that enable abuse and how we can all work to challenge those systems.
It's about truly listening to survivors, believing their stories, and demanding accountability from those in power. It's a much bigger issue than just one man or one industry.
Right. R. Kelly's story, it's almost like a microcosm of the bigger societal issues we're facing. Issues of power, abuse, and how we protect those with influence while often ignoring the most vulnerable among us.
That's a really good point. It's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it's easy to look at this and think, oh, this is a story about one man's downfall. But like you said, it goes way beyond just R. Kelly, right? It's about all the systems that let this happen in the first place.
It really does. We see how power, fame, these societal structures, they can create this perfect storm where abuse can just fester. I think if we really want to learn from this, we have to ask ourselves, like, how did R. Kelly get away with this for so long? Despite all the whispers, the accusations, it's not like it was a complete secret.
No, definitely not. It was out there. People were talking about it. Yet he was still making hit records.
Right. So the media, they have to take some responsibility here. For years, it seemed like there is this reluctance to really dig deep, to give these accusations the attention they deserved. Maybe it was easier to just focus on the music, on his success, and kind of push the darker stuff to the side.
Yeah, I wonder too if there was this, maybe a subconscious bias. People couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that this guy who was making music that so many people loved could also be capable of these awful things.
That's a good point. And then, of course, you can't ignore the role of race, how that plays into perceptions of guilt and innocence, especially in our justice system. Kelly's case, like so many others, unfolded in a system that often has these built-in biases, particularly against Black men and women.
And of course, there's the power dynamic itself. I mean, Kelly was wealthy, influential. He had this whole network of people around him, enablers who were invested in protecting him and silencing anyone who might speak out.
That's such a common thread in these kinds of cases, isn't it? Abuse of power. It doesn't matter what industry, what social status. These abusers, they create these environments of fear, dependency, isolation. It makes it so hard for victims to break free, to come forward with their stories.
And even when they do find the courage to speak out, what happens? They're often met with disbelief, they're blamed, their stories are questioned, even attacked. It just perpetuates this cycle of silence that allows the abuse to continue.
It's heartbreaking. But the hashtag MeToo movement, it's been huge in starting to break down that cycle. It's given survivors a voice, a platform, and a sense of community they didn't have before. Of course, there's still so much work to do to really shift the culture, to create a space where victims feel truly safe, believed, and empowered.
So, as we wrap up, what are the big takeaways from R. Kelly's story? What can we learn from this and apply to the larger conversation around justice, accountability, all of that?
Well, I think one of the most important things is we have to believe survivors. Their stories matter, their experiences are valid, and their voices deserve to be heard without question. We also need to recognize and challenge the systems that protect abusers, no matter how powerful or influential they may be.
And movements like hashtag MeToo, they show us that collective action, it can make a difference. Real change is possible, but it requires us to keep pushing, to speak up against injustice, to support those who have been marginalized and silenced for far too long. It wasn't just one thing that brought R. Kelly down.
Right. It was a whole bunch of factors coming together. You have the bravery of the survivors who came forward, the journalists and investigators who kept digging for the truth, and then this shift in the culture that finally made it possible for those voices to be heard and believed. It's a powerful reminder that change can happen, but we have to keep fighting for it.
It really is. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the complicated and ultimately tragic story of R. Kelly. Thanks for joining us. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.